coming up on the 36th anniversary of my ordination to the ministry, and it's been quite a ride these 36 years. It's been a source of great joy, great celebration, so much I look back on, and I'm grateful to God for being a part of, including being a part of this congregation. But there also were profound challenges and heartaches and broken-hearted moments. And there have been several times throughout my ministry where I thought, I think I'm just going to stop doing this. It's pretty hard. It'd be pretty, again, painful, disappointing. Because so often the church, doesn't act the way the church is supposed to. And people in churches can be mean-spirited. And pastors sometimes are the recipients of that. And sometimes pastors don't respond well either. But I never have left. And I think the reason might be, if I ponder that, it's what happened to me, I think, like when I was a young child, 7, 8, 9 years old, sitting in the Sunday school classrooms of Tustin Presbyterian Church, Tustin, California, where I grew up, sitting there every Sunday with people like Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Noble, and we'd go over these Bible stories and talk about Jesus. A young heart, young mind taking in these stories. And I realized at some point that these stories did something to me. They got into me, and they found a place in my heart and my mind. And I began, not intentionally, but really just noticing that I began to be captivated by this person, Jesus. Began to wonder about him. Began to think about him a lot, and I realized back then that these stories had a way of shaping my heart even before I knew it was happening. And I think every time as an adult I think, well, I'm just going to walk away from this. It's like those stories and what they did to me keep me anchored in a way that I don't even today fully understand. In thinking about that experience, I came across these words by Richard Powers, who said, the best arguments in the world won't change a single person's mind. Only a good story can do that. The best arguments in the world can't change a single mind. Only a good story can do that. And I think that's being proven true right now in our culture. We live in a time and an age where we just love to argue. And it seems to live in a time where these United States have become divided states because the spirit of argumentation has possessed the heart and the spirit of our land. We love to argue about everything, it seems like. You name an issue, I guarantee people will feel hot-headed on both sides of that argument. We live in a profoundly polarized age where we have very different views about how our culture should look. Who should be allowed to get married? Who should make health care choices for their own bodies? We make choices and have opinions about who and what should be done in every aspect of our lives. We become polarized by red and blue, black and white, rich and poor, gay and straight. You name it, there's an argument to be joined into. And part of what's happening, of course, is we have these arguments, but beyond the arguments themselves is a desire in many ways to use our political process to enforce state powers to allow our particular view of that argument to be codified and to be enforced. That our way of seeing things really is the right way and needs to be defended by the law of the land. And so we're busy trying to legislate in ways that reflect our particular side of these perspectives. I was thinking the other day, I remember hearing one time when our spiritual ancestors back in Scotland, 1655, Presbyterians especially loved to argue. We are an arguing, debating kind of the branch of Christ's tree. And one time, the Scots were at each other, debating something, and Oliver Cromwell stood up and he said, I beseech thee, in the bowels of Christ, to consider that you may be wrong. I don't know how successful Cromwell was, but my guess was the Scottish Presbyterians just kept on arguing. We love to argue. And we keep discovering, don't we, that no matter how well we couch our arguments, present our truths and our facts, it never seems to sway anybody else's perspective. You ever noticed that with your own family? You go to whatever, a family gathering, you have a sibling, a brother, an uncle, an aunt, whatever, and you start talking about something, and you realize, I can't believe they think that way. My God, how is that possible? How can somebody be so stupid? So uninformed. And of course, they're thinking the same thing, right, about you. And despite how well you couch your words, no matter how precisely you present the facts, boom, bounces off. Not a change of the mind is going to happen. The only thing, says Richard Powers, that can change a person's mind is a good story. I think the gospel writers understood that. You know, we've been left with 4 gospels that are not 4 compilations of theological arguments. We provided that later as a church, but originally the Gospels were simply a collection of stories. Let me tell you some stories about Jesus. There's this story. There's that story. How about this story? And the Gospel writers knew that somehow if you learn the stories and the stories get in you, something is going to change by the grace of the Spirit. I mean, John even says at the end of his gospel, I've written all these stories about Jesus so that you may believe in him, and that by believing in him you may have life in his name. And then he goes on to say, you know, if I had written down all the stories about Jesus, he said, I'm guessing that the entire earth would not have enough space to contain all the books that could be written. But I narrowed it down, he says. I narrowed it down to these 21 chapters. I selected stories that I thought might get into you. I work in your heart and mind the way they did for me as a young child and the way they still do today. And one of those stories that made the cut that John did include in his gospel is taken here on the last night of Jesus' life. May our hearts be invaded by the story. May it stick to us. And may it ask deep questions of us. Listen now for God's word to us. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from the world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus answered, you do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand. Peter said to him, you will never wash my feet. And he answered, unless I wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, one who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you, for he knew who was to betray him. For this reason, he said, not all of you are clean. After he'd washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. May God bless to our living and to our reading hearing of God's holy word. When I was in seminary, I spent some time as a student being a chaplain at the Trenton State Prison, which is the last stop in the New Jersey penitentiary system, and it was the place where they housed death row inmates. A couple of times I've ventured on to death row, and it was a profoundly extraordinary experience. I went there one night around 9 o'clock in the evening as a student chaplain, and it was so loud. People were yelling and screaming, and the guard said, "It's always like this. You almost go insane from the noise." And then, of course, when you are a resident of that part of the prison, you're waiting, trying to hold off a date that you will be executed. And when that date is set and the day arrives, and there's certain customs that condemned people follow, one of the things is you get a final meal. You get to decide what will be your last earthly food. And people make choices. They want a couple of steaks. They want a milkshake. They decide, I'm going to go out and having exactly the best food I can imagine. They might meet with a priest or a rabbi or a pastor. They might try to get their heart ready for what's coming. Well, here John gives us an insight into what Jesus did, knowing he was a condemned man. He knew that the authorities were going to be arriving momentarily. He knew what was going to happen. You know, back in Jesus' day, there was no constitutional requirement that a method of execution be humane. It was very inhumane, of course, what crucifixion was. He knew that was coming shortly, and so he spends the last night of his life having a last meal. But not any last meal. It's the Passover meal. He's reenacting this central ritual of his faith where God passed over the Hebrews and curses laid upon the Egyptians that would lead them to be free. So he's going through this meal, but he adds this ritual that I know that no condemned person in Trenton State Prison would have been asked to do, to wash other people's feet. I mean, who would want to do that in the last night of their lives, get down on their knees and wash the grime and the crap and the filth off of the feet of those who are next to you? As I shared before, this was a custom that would happen whenever somebody would enter your house. You would have perhaps a servant boy or a servant girl wash the guest of honor's feet. And if there was no servant, then you would do that. And what would happen is you would wash the feet of the person who was your same social standing. So you would wash the persons next to you, and finally someone then would wash the feet of the guest of honor. But here, on this last night, no one has taken the time to wash each other's feet. The disciples should have gotten in line to do that, but they didn't. And maybe the reason is that when Luke tells the story of the Last Supper, guess what happens? An argument breaks out. Maybe they were the first American disciples. Hey, let's have a debate, they say. Let's debate who is the greatest disciple. Who's the most important one? Who does Jesus need most of all? Who's the one that has the most faith? Who's the one that's most gifted, the most dedicated? And they're arguing back and forth. They're debating. They're presenting facts. And they're probably also denigrating the support that each person is asserting for themselves. No, you're not that important. I remember when you did that. I mean, do you remember when you did that? It was terrible. It was stupid. You can't possibly be as good as I am. The last night of Christ's life, they're arguing about which one of them is the greatest. 3 years of being tutored by God in human form, and that's where they're arriving at. After watching his example, his spirit, his teachings, who's the best? Who's the greatest? Jesus tried to address that earlier on in his ministry. They also were arguing, again, about position, status. And he says, look, whoever wants to be great amongst you must be the servant or slave of all. If you want to be great, you got to pour yourself into servanthood. You have to dive down deep into humility. That's the way that God defines greatness. I know it's not the way humans do, but that's always the way it is with God. God's thoughts are never our thoughts. They're almost always diametrically opposed. So you think it's great to be elevated, to be noticed, to have power. I'm telling you, greatness is defined by self-giving, by forgetting, and by serving. We throw the word great around a lot right now in our culture, right? Make America great again. You think anybody's thinking, make America great again means let's make America a servant nation and wash the feet of other countries? Let's see how humble we can become as a nation. That would make us great in the eyes of Christ. But I guarantee you, when we talk about making America great, we're not talking about a downward dive into self-forgetting and servanthood, are we? It's who's the biggest, who's the best, who's the strongest, who's the richest, who's the most this or most that. That's what being great is. Which means that as a Christian nation, we have not really taken any of this very seriously. We've allowed other stories to shape our notion of greatness and being successful and being human. And all we can offer as Christians in response are some stories from Jesus. I guarantee you we're not going to argue our way out of our predicament. The only way out is to have a changed mind, a changed heart, a changed perspective, and perhaps only stories can do that. Our story has been we are an exceptional nation. We are an exceptional people. We are the ones who bring light. We are the ones lifted up. We are the ones that are this or that. And the disciples were presenting their own arguments for their own exceptionalism as disciples. Jesus tore that down. None of that makes you exceptional. It makes you lost. It means you're living in ways contrary to reality, which is God. The only exceptionalism that matters is to be exceptional in your humility, in your giving, in your regard for others. That's what God looks for in terms of exceptionalism. And they still don't get it. And so he decides, well, maybe, just maybe, if I get down on my hands and knees and wash their feet, maybe that will get through. And so this Messiah and Savior, the long-awaited anointed one, gets down on that last night, takes off his outer robe, puts a towel around his waist, and he begins to wash the feet of the disciples. He begins to wipe off the grime and the mud and the animal excrement that's been caked to their feet. He's down there with his hands wiping and cleaning their feet. And by the way, the feet that he's washing are who? The feet of those who not too long will use those same feet to scurry away and run and hide. They'll use those feet, Judas will, to run to the authorities, to betray him. Peter will use those feet to run away from the servant girl who will say, surely you are his friend. No, I don't know him. They'll use their feet to do what? To save their own skin. They'll forsake him, deny him, betray him. And what's he doing? He's washing the feet of those people who are going to use those feet to get as far away from him as possible. And John tells this story because he's talking here about the story of God, and the one who's on his knees washing people's feet is God himself. That God, the Creator, says John, is washing the feet of the creatures who will forsake him. What kind of a God, a Creator, gets down on his knees to wash the feet of creatures who have really little regard for him? Is that what a great God would do? Wouldn't a great God show power and might and frustration? What are you doing washing the feet of these unfaithful, fickle people? And so Jesus does this ritual, then he says, do you understand what I've done? What do you think? Do you think they actually understood what he had just done? Do you think the disciples finally had a light bulb go on? Oh, it's about this. It's about self-emptying and giving away and serving. Now I get it. Do you think they got it? Maybe a more important question. Do you think we do? You think we get it? Do we understand what he's talking about? It's a kind of story, if you sit with it, will begin to work on you. What's he talking about? Why would he do this? He says, you'll be blessed if you do it. You'll be blessed if you get down and you take on the heart of a servant. You'll be blessed. And what do you think? What kind of blessing might that bring? Well, maybe, just maybe, we could be freed from judging, maligning, denigrating, separating, dehumanizing. Maybe we would get away from the whole idea that you are the other who needs to be opposed. Stop. We need to restrict you. We need to stop you. And maybe what would happen would be a different sense of going out in service and love to your sister or your brother. A perspective of humility. What might happen if we were to enter a story where all of God's beings are guided by humility and servanthood? What might that do to change the story, the trajectory of our own nation? What might that do to the heart and soul of us personally and collectively? We don't know. What I can tell you is the story we have been living is a story that's suicidal. The story we are now living will lead us simply down a darker and darker road as we become more and more ensconced in our own position, hard-hearted, cruel to each other. The only way out will not be through legislation, even through elections. It'll be through the hearts and minds of people who enter into a different story, where greatness and godliness are understood in a radically different way than they have been for a long, long time. Jesus came to invite us into that story. A story that is compelling and freeing and uniting. A story that is, at its heart, is redemptive for all of us. And it is to this God who gives us these stories of grace and hope that we give all praise and honor and glory today, tomorrow, and indeed forevermore.